You don't listen to Venezuela. A letter from President Maduro tells the UN human rights chief. The opposition in St. Kitts and Nevis complains it was excluded from a meeting of Eastern Caribbean states. And a historic victory for Ecuador's Waorani as a court reaffirms no drilling for oil on their land. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo. This is from the South. The Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has sent a letter to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, strongly rejecting her report on Venezuela. President Maduro said the content of Michelle Bachelet's report was, quote, deeply harmful to the dignity of the Venezuelan people and the truth of the human rights situation in Venezuela. He added that it repeated the version of her predecessors at the UN Human Rights Office, and that, like those, it was based on false statements, distortions, and the manipulation of data. And the representative of Venezuela at the UN in Geneva, Jorge Valero, read part of President Maduro's letters to Michelle Bachelet. Here's what it had to say.
The
report presented by your office to the Human Rights Council on July 5th has come to my notice. Its content is deeply harmful to the dignity of the Venezuelan people and the truth of the human rights situation in Venezuela. Unfortunately, it is quite clear that you did not listen to Venezuela. You have presented a report fraught with false statements, distortions and manipulation of data and sources. A report that lacks balance and rigor, openly biased, that, while presenting a distorted account of the human rights situation in our country, does not reflect the information and data provided by the state, but that of the tried media narratives imposed by the imperial media hegemony. Can a political project legitimized 23 times at the ballot box in the last 20 years be called a dictatorship? Can it be called a humanitarian crisis when the United States has deprived Venezuela of more than $30 billion of its oil assets abroad, has blocked and confiscated more than $7 billion allocated to the purchase of food and medicine? It has forbidden servicing the Venezuelan debt and persecutes any company that trades with Venezuela? Know that Venezuela will continue standing victoriously, that no false report, no attack, regardless of its coerciousness, will tamper with our firm determination of continuing to be a free and sovereign people committed to the defense of its legitimate rights. From the homeland of Bolivar and Chavez, I bid you farewell, not without demanding a soon rectification of the report in question.
Talks between the Venezuelan government and the opposition are set to continue after 3 days of dialogue in Barbados concluded on Wednesday. President Maduro says that a permanent forum for peace was agreed and the talks would center on a 6-point agenda. However, he said that he would not be giving details at the request of the government of Norway, which brokered the talks.
We can't say everything, but we must say something regarding the permanent dialogue table, because we have made commitments with the government of Norway, with the Venezuelan opposition, to take with prudence all of the issues which we hold conversations over and take care of this permanent dialogue table, which exists and which is active, functioning with the Venezuelan opposition, promoted by the desire for peace. You all know that as of months ago, I spoke with many parties from around the world. I had very good conversations with the government of Norway, of which we know very well as together we participated, Norway and Venezuela, in the process of peace between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, and the government of Colombia. We were together for 4 years, and we know them well. And they proposed to me a number of initiatives, of meetings, of encounters, of dialogue with the Venezuelan opposition. And I said, great, I'm in total agreement. Let's do it. I believe in dialogue. I believe in my word. I believe in peace. I believe in the diplomacy of peace.
Protests are planned this Friday outside the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City against President Donald Trump's treatment of migrants. A series of social movements are also expected to demonstrate in different cities in the U.S. It's been reported that ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, is planning to begin mass raids on undocumented migrants from Sunday. But immigration rights groups say they don't trust ICE.
Las personas deben
People should keep the door closed. They should not open the door for anyone, only if the agent has a warrant signed by you with the correct name and family name and the correct address of that person. If there is nobody in the house that goes by that name, then you don't have to open the door.
One of the most dire consequences of anti-migrant policy spreading across in the U.S. is the inhumane treatment of minors in detention centers. Our correspondent in the U.S., Alina Duarte, brings us more on this desperate situation.
While desperately seeking out a better life for her and her daughter in the U.S., Yasmin Juarez confronted perhaps the harshest irony, the death of her 21-month-old daughter. The grieving mother says it was the deplorable conditions and the lack of proper medical services at the migrant detention center that contributed to her child's death.
You have no idea how hard it has been for me to go on without my daughter. They took a piece of my heart away. They tore my soul apart.
The Border Patrol officers also dished out abuse and threats. She says they kept asking her why she was seeking asylum in the U.S. as though she had no right to do so.
He said to me, you know, this is an American country and our president is Donald Trump, and we can take your daughter away and put you in jail. I was speechless, and all I could do was cry.
Heart-wrenching accounts such as this one are very common in the U.S. It was recently reported that minors detained at the newly opened detention center in Yuma, Arizona, suffered sexual abuse.
Who alleges she was sexually assaulted by a Border Patrol agent.
In addition to the unhygienic, overcrowded conditions in these detention centers, a report has revealed that a U.S. custody agent touched the breasts and genitals of a 15-year-old girl while other agents laughed as they watched. Meanwhile, a Honduran child was severely mocked and bullied. Many U.S. lawmakers who toured these detention centers have publicly condemned these atrocities.
We don't need new laws. We need morality. We need an administration that understands there are human rights violations happening.
While human rights organizations, activists, and a sizable segment of the U.S. population have demanded the shutdown of these detention centers, the Immigration and Customs Services keeps opening new facilities along the border.
Washington, D.C.
The state of Louisiana in the U.S. is bracing for impact as Tropical Storm Barry approaches. It's expected to make landfall on Saturday morning. The National Hurricane Center declared Barry the second named storm of the Atlantic hurricane season, with maximum sustained winds of 40 miles per hour and moving west at 5 miles per hour. Hurricane watches have been issued, a state of emergency has also been declared, and over 10,000 people have been told to evacuate from along Louisiana's coast. Governor of Louisiana warned that Tropical Storm Barry will be a very significant severe weather event. St. Kitts' opposition is demanding an explanation for its exclusion from last month's Assembly of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. Opposition leader Dr. Denzel Douglas has written to the House Speaker and the OECS chair, Antiguan Prime Minister Gaston Brown, on that matter. Dr. Douglas said this is a violation of the governing treaty. He adds that such a deliberate act files in the face of the democratic principles of transparency and accountability that the OECS Assembly was created to defend. The Central Bank of Barbados is warning the public and business owners to be on the lookout for counterfeit money in circulation. In recent months, there has been an increase in the number of counterfeit notes, particularly $100 notes from the older 207 series, as well as $20 notes from the new series. The central bank has published a list of duplicated serial numbers which were found on several counterfeit notes. More information about the security features can be found on the Central Bank's website at www.centralbank.org.bb. The third day of talks between Guyana's government and opposition on the selection of a new elections commission chair came to an abrupt end after the two sides were unable to agree on the issues. So far, the government has rejected 5 of the opposition's proposed nominees, while 4 have been shortlisted and 2 are under active consideration. Both sides are trying to find a replacement to carry out the necessary early elections following a no-confidence vote that collapsed the government.
If the 8 names submitted to the president, by the president, suggested to the leader of the opposition, are names that are not unacceptable to the president. If these are names that are not unacceptable to the president, as a representative of the leader of the opposition, we have taken those names to the leader of the opposition. He has said publicly up until today they are under his consideration. It therefore means that when he's going to make his final 6, those 8 names, which the president submitted, would be under consideration. Today we are learning in this meeting that not even the 8 names that came from the president, they will be able to say finds acceptability with the president.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back to Telesur English. In Ecuador, the indigenous Waorani people have defeated the government in a court of appeal. They succeeded in blocking the sale of 180,000 hectares of Amazon rainforest for oil drilling. This comes after Ecuador's Environment Ministry appealed a court's decision in the Pastaza region that ruled in favor of the Waoranis. In April, the court of Cuyo ruled that the government had violated the community's rights when it sought to drill for oil on their land. A UN Security Council delegation is beginning a visit to Colombia to evaluate the implementation of the peace agreements. Victims of the armed conflict, representatives of the FARC political party, and directors of the transitional justice system will explain to them the grave situation facing the peace process.
Judges from the transitional justice system have said that the government of President Ivan Duque will cut by 30% the budgets for the Truth Commission, the unit to search for missing people, and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, or JEP.
We didn't expect such a drastic reduction. For the JEP, we had a budget of 90 billion pesos for 2019. For 2020, they have told us it will be 67 billion. The same goes for the search unit and the commission. This doesn't make sense, just as we're beginning to implement the process.
This cut leaves the victims in a limbo, who've suffered the worst horrors of this armed conflict.
This is a cut in the money the unit has to carry out searches on the ground. If it is cut by 30%, we will be obliged to scale back our searches for missing people in the region. And these searches cannot be done in Bogota. We have to be out there in the regions.
The budget cut was announced after President Duque's trip to Europe, where he promised that the government was committed to applying the peace agreements.
In economic terms, they are saying, we won't give you what you need because we don't like what you're going to do with it. This is consistent with all their behavior, but it contradicts what they are saying internationally when they ask for financial support. This is destroying the agreement made in Havana and celebrated at the Colón Theater. It destroys the possibility of the victims obtaining their rights.
The political party of the FARC has asked the countries that finance the peace process to demand the government explains where the peace money has gone.
This corruption must be stopped and those responsible be identified, because they can say the money has gone or incorporating former guerrillas when that's not true. People still don't have land or houses and the production projects haven't started.
While the money doesn't seem to have been spent on implementing the peace accords, the delegates from the Security Council are arriving in Colombia to evaluate the state of the peace process. The victims and the FARC party will be telling them that the country faces a very serious situation with little achieved in terms of reincorporation, equality and social spending, while former combatants and social leaders are being murdered every day.
Thousands of students from across Brazil have taken to the streets of Brasilia to demand freedom for former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The student protesters will join a list of campaigners who say Lula was the victim of a political ploy to keep him from returning to power. The Intercept published a range of documents that show Lula's conviction was politically motivated and that his conviction was a result of an accusation violating the legal process directed by Judge Sergio Moro. Our correspondent, Danai Galetti, is with the students at their protests in Brasilia.
The 10,000 students who are taking part in the National Student Union Congress at the University of Brasilia are now holding a demonstration in front of the government ministries here in Brasilia. They are demanding a stop to cuts in funding for state university. This is a continuation of the campaign they began in May, with a number of protests against the policies of President Jair Bolsonaro, which they say hurt both students and workers. They are also demanding the release of the former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and they are protesting against increased sewage pollution in poor urban neighborhoods, the anti-crime policies of the Justice Minister Sergio Moro, and the influence of the ultra-conservative sectors who oppose advances in science and education. They want to tell President Bolsonaro that Brazil can only progress on the basis of free, quality education and with youth taking a leading role.
We thank Danai for that report. A South African court has found the son of former President Jacob Zuma not guilty of both culpable homicide and reckless driving. The court ruled that the state failed to prove that Dudusane Zuma acted in any way that resulted in his Porsche colliding with a minibus during a 2014 crash. A woman was killed and at least one other injured in the incident. Zuma, who said he lost control of the car after a puddle caused the vehicle to skid, initially avoided prosecution after the National Prosecuting Authority decided not to charge him. The NPA, however, reversed its decision last year after a rights group threatened to prosecute Zuma privately. Zuma's acquittal concludes the case that has spanned 5 years. The South African government is deploying their military in various townships of the city of Cape Town to assist the police to combat soaring incidences of gang violence. Police Minister Becky Seal said the deployment will be for a period of 3 months. The move comes after gang-related violence killed 13 people in the city last weekend. The city has recently seen an upsurge in gang violence. According to police records, over 1,600 people have been murdered in Cape Town since January. In South Africa, the Friends of Cuba Society held protests in front of the parliament, calling for an end to the U.S. economic blockade against Cuba. We have more in this report.
Hands off Cuba, hands off! Hands off! Hands off Cuba, hands off! Hands off!
Most of the protesters were not even born when Cubans shed their blood on African soil for the freedom South Africans enjoy today.
The Cubans have continued to show practical solidarity, where today, for example, there are more than 2,000 young South Africans who are studying medicine in Cuba. But the Cubans have also sent people in the areas of engineering and housing and many other areas to our country to help us build a just and equitable society.
Among those protesting are members of the South African Communist Party, the Young Communist League and Friends of Cuba Society. Protesters expressed disgust with the tightening of US sanctions against Cuba.
President Trump has decided to enact Article 3 of the Helms-Burton Act, which allows American citizens to lay claim against properties that has been nationalized by the Cuban Revolution. The impact of that in terms of the economy and the livelihood of the Cubans are immense.
This month is a month of the Cubans when they get their revolution. It was July. So what we are showing now, we are showing the support of them, that since they are celebrating on the 26th of July, we are showing that we are with them all the years, because they were also with us before. They are still with us today.
The Friends of Cuba Society are planning a number of protests this month, also as a celebration of the Cuban Revolution 60 years ago. Johan Abrams for Telesur in Cape Town.
Coming up after the break, a celebration of African culture in Uruguay. Stay with us. To Telesur English. The first shipment of S-400 missile parts from Russia has arrived in Turkey. The development will likely escalate tensions with the United States, which has threatened sanctions over the deal. The U.S. has claimed that the Russian military hardware is not compatible with NATO's defense systems and that the acquisition may lead to Ankara's expulsion from an F-35 fighter jet program. But Turkey's foreign minister says the agreement with Russia is a done deal. Explosions at the funeral of a senior military commander of the so-called Libyan National Army has left 4 people dead and dozens wounded. A spokesperson for the LNA said the explosions were caused by car bombs that targeted senior military officials who were attending the burial of a former Special Forces commander in the city of Benghazi. The LNA has been engaged in fierce fighting with forces allied to the UN-recognized Government of National Unity since April, when it launched an offensive to overrun the GNU from Tripoli.
The operation was arranged in good order. The first explosion was at the beginning of the cemetery to the west of the grave. Then the last 2 explosions were on the withdrawal path or the evacuation path in the cemetery to cause the greatest damage to citizens. The second bombing was in the place where we stood. There was a parked car and it exploded. Then we went out and the third car exploded.
As calls mount against racism and police brutality by Israeli police officers towards Israeli citizens of Ethiopian descent, musicians are using their talent to speak out against the 2 vices. Musicians and artists have joined hands to produce music which highlights the struggles of the Ethiopian community in Israel. The country has, in the last couple of days, been rocked by protests after an 18-year-old teenager was killed by an off-duty police officer on June 30th.
The racism that we suffer here is expressed in the music, and it empowers the young generations not to fear, but to do what they love. The opposite is what they feel in their neighborhoods, which is discrimination by the police.
And finally, we go to Uruguay, where July is a month of celebration for the country's African diaspora. Throughout the month, Afro-Uruguayan citizens celebrate their history, their achievements, and come together so their voices can be heard.
Candombe is perhaps the most important expression of Afro-Uruguayan culture, but it's hardly the only one. For the fourth year running, the Uruguayan government has declared July as the month of the African diaspora, in the hopes of promoting policies that improve matters of social inclusion, healthcare, and housing for Afro-Uruguayans.
This is a month promoted by public institutions, but it would be good to see private companies and various social sectors use this month to analyze and help improve the situation of Afro-Uruguayans.
This month will see many events centered on the lives of Afro-Uruguayan women. One of the most important events will be the launch of the Marielle Fund, named after the Afro-Brazilian human rights activist Marielle Franco. It seeks to link together many different social struggles.
The Marielle Fund hopes to link together different social struggles against racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. We hope to see various social organizations come together to present projects that would, in some way, unite the fight against these various issues.
Afro-Uruguayans make up 8% of the country's population, and within the community there are often higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to education than the wider population. Despite recent advances in these areas, things have not improved sufficiently for Afro-Uruguayans.
Living conditions nowadays have a double edge. On one side, there's been progress in relation to the past, because the poverty and unemployment rates were much higher. Nonetheless, inequality is still an issue, and work needs to be done to improve the living conditions of Afro-Uruguayans.
The choice of July as the month of the African diaspora has a deeper significance. As on July 18th, Nelson Mandela International Day is already celebrated, and July 25th is the International Day of the Afro-Latin American and Caribbean woman.
And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And for our viewers in Africa, remember you can find us on StarSat channel 461 in South Africa and channel 539 in Nigeria. We're on social media as well, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.